Russia last night issued a chilling warning to Britain not to threaten a nuclear power. As Theresa May prepared to unveil retaliatory measures against Moscow, the Kremlin refused to explain how its former spy Sergei Skripal was poisoned with a military-grade nerve agent in Britain. And, in a coded reference to Vladimir Putin's boasts about his nuclear arsenal, Russian officials warned any threat to take punitive measures against Russia will meet with a response. The British side should be aware of that. Moscow said it would not comply with a deadline of midnight last night to answer Britain's questions about the poisoning outrage in Salisbury 10 days ago. This means that, with the backing of the US, Germany, and France, Mrs. May is now heading toward a showdown with President Putin and his regime. The extraordinary threat came as Theresa May signed up US President Donald Trump's support to back the UK all the way in the standoff with the Kremlin. As the incendiary row grew rapidly, Kremlin spokeswoman Maria Zakharova was reported as saying in Moscow one should not threaten a nuclear power. Russia has demanded to see samples of the Novichok substance found in Sergei Skripal's body before it will consider responding to Mrs. May's midnight deadline. Mrs. May has been building support among world leaders since announcing last night Britain believed it highly likely Russia was to blame for the attack. Before speaking to Mr. Trump tonight, Mrs. May had already secured the backing of German Chancellor Angela Merkel and French President Emmanuel Macron. The Russian embassy in London weighed in on the matter with an incredible series of tweets featuring threatening messages accompanied by pictures of what appears to be vials of poison. The Prime Minister is expected to impose tough sanctions against Moscow on Wednesday, including booting out Russian diplomats and seizing the assets of Mr. Putin's cronies. As relations between the two countries hit what was their lowest point since the Cold War, following the call with President Trump, Downing Street said, the Prime Minister spoke to President Trump earlier this afternoon to update him on the ongoing investigation into the Salisbury incident. The Prime Minister set out the conclusion reached by the UK government that it was highly likely that Russia was responsible for the attack against Sergei and Yulia Skripal. President Trump said the US was with the UK all the way, agreeing that the Russian government must provide unambiguous answers as to how this nerve agent came to be used. In a series of incendiary tweets tonight, Russia's London embassy said UK Ambassador Lawrence Bristow was summoned to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Russia, where First Deputy FM Vladimir Titov strongly protested the evidence-free accusations by the UK authorities of Russia's alleged involvement in the poisoning of Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia. It was stated that the actions of the UK authorities are a clear provocation and that the Russian Federation was not involved in the incident that took place in Salisbury on March 4, 2018. Moscow will not respond to London's ultimatum until it receives samples of the chemical substance to which the UK investigators are referring. Britain must comply with the Chemical Weapons Convention, which stipulates joint investigation into the incident, for which Moscow is ready. Without that, there can be no sense in any statements from London. The incident appears to be yet another crooked attempt by the UK authorities to discredit Russia. Any threat to take punitive measures against Russia will meet with a response. The British side should be aware of that. Today the embassy sent a note to the Foreign Office reiterating that Russia is not involved in the Salisbury incident and outlining the above-mentioned demands for joint investigation. Earlier Mr. Trump told reporters outside the White House, "Well, it sounds to me, I'm speaking to Theresa May today." It sounds to me like it would be Russia based on all of the evidence they have. I don't know if they've come to a conclusion, but she's calling me today." Following the call with Mrs. Merkel, Downing Street said they discussed the pattern of aggressive Russian behavior and agreed it would be important to act in unison with allies to counter it. Chancellor Merkel condemned the attack and said she stood in full solidarity with the UK. They agreed that the international community should coordinate closely as the investigation developed and in the wake of Russia's response. Senior MEP Guy Verhofstadt offered EU support and said, "We stand shoulder to shoulder with the British people." It must be made clear that an attack against one EU and NATO country is an attack on all of us. It comes as the clock is ticking on the midnight deadline Mrs. May has given for the Russians to explain how their nerve agent was used in an attempted murder on the sleepy streets of Salisbury. British officials are drawing up a plan to hit back hard at Russia if, as expected, they do not have an explanation. The government is expected to draw up a list of tough sanctions that will target the Kremlin and Putin's cronies, freezing assets and stopping them from traveling to the UK. They are also expected to expel many of Russia's diplomats, although probably not break off diplomatic relations altogether with the country. British officials and the royal family are expected to boycott the Football World Cup in Russia later this year. But Britain will need to get support from the country's UN and NATO allies in order to impose sanctions that will really bite and be felt by the Kremlin. The PM yesterday dramatically pointed the finger at Putin for the poison attack, saying it was highly likely it was ordered by the country. The Prime Minister said the facts increasingly suggested Russia was behind the apparent hit on double agent Sergei Skripal in Salisbury. Branding the attack a reckless and despicable act, Mrs. May said the substance used was a military-grade agent Moscow has produced. Mrs. May said the government would not accept such an attempt to murder innocent civilians on our soil. Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson said allies are mobilizing to support the UK and hit back at Russia. Speaking today, he said, "I've been very encouraged so far by the strength of the support that we are getting. I think in particular from President Macron of France, I talked to Sigmar Gabriel, my German counterpart, and from Washington where Rex Tillerson last night made it absolutely clear that he sees this as part of a pattern of disruptive behavior, increasingly disruptive behavior, malign behavior by Russia, the reckless use of chemical weapons, the support for the reckless use of chemical weapons which stretches from Syria now to the streets of Salisbury. I've been encouraged by the willingness of our friends to show support and solidarity." Home Secretary Amber Rudd oversaw an emergency Cobra committee into the crisis this morning. She said, "The Russians have started responding. The Prime Minister has been very clear that they have until midnight tonight to satisfy her requests. Until then we will wait and see what they have put forward. I know that international allies have begun to rally their support and make comments publicly, but at the moment what we are doing is awaiting the Russian response before stepping up and responding as the Prime Minister has said we will." White House sources said yesterday they were accelerating their offensive cyber program and could hit select targets for a specific effect. It is understood this could see a specialist cyber unit deployed in the UK to attack Kremlin computer networks spewing Russian propaganda and trolling factories spreading fake news. Together with Russia's previous actions and tactics, including the killing of Alexander Litvinenko, the UK authorities yesterday concluded it was highly likely to be involved in the episode. In a tough statement updating MPs after a meeting of the National Security Council, Mrs. May raised the prospect of significant retaliation, making clear that the UK is already consulting NATO and other allies. It is now clear that Mr. Skripal and his daughter were poisoned with military-grade nerve agent of a type developed by Russia, Mrs. May said. This is part of a group of nerve agents known as Novichok. Another option is for the government to implement a British version of the US's Magnitsky Act, which lists Russians involved in corruption and human rights abuses, banning them from entering the country. There could be fresh sanctions against senior figures in the Putin regime, either with the EU or unilaterally. General Sir Christophe Varel, commander of Joint Forces Command, has revealed how the UK has a specialist unit which is dedicated to offensive cyber run jointly by the MOD and GCHQ. So far it has worked on Islamic State, but this could be expanded towards Russia. In an interview with the Mail last week, he said the military could hit back at disinformation spread by Russian trolling factories. He said, "There are two ways you could respond. One is putting your own messages out to compete with the messages that actors like that are sending. And the other is with a cyber attack. Whether or not you could use cyber as a weapon would depend upon the specific circumstances and the law." He said that there was a specific capability in which troops tackle mistruths spread by enemies. Russia's ambassador was summoned to the Foreign Office at 3:45 p.m. yesterday for a cool but firm meeting with Boris Johnson. There was no handshake between the politicians as Mr. Johnson outlined the outrage felt by the British people. She added, based on the positive identification of this chemical agent by world-leading experts at the laboratory at Portdown, our knowledge that Russia has previously produced this agent and would still be capable of doing so, Russia's record of conducting state-sponsored assassinations, and our assessment that Russia views defectors as a legitimate target for assassination, the government has concluded that it is highly likely Russia was responsible for the act against Sergei and Yulia Skripal. Mrs. May said Boris Johnson had summoned the Russian ambassador in London yesterday afternoon and informed him of the findings. The Kremlin was given a deadline of midnight to respond to the evidence, and the government could outline its detailed retaliation later today. Should there be no credible response, we will conclude that his action amounts to an unlawful use of force by the Russian state against the United Kingdom, and I will come back to this House and set out the full range of measures that we will take in response, she said. This attempted murder using a weapons-grade nerve agent on a British town was not just a crime against the Skripals, it was an indiscriminate and reckless act against the United Kingdom, putting the lives of innocent civilians at risk, she said. And we will not tolerate such a brazen attempt to murder innocent civilians on our soil. Russia's foreign ministry posted this sarcastic response on Twitter this morning, but the Russian foreign ministry showed little sign of readiness to explain itself, immediately deriding Mrs. May's remarks as a circus show. The ministry appeared to reference Mrs. May's address to MPs with a video of a snow-covered traffic jam, accompanied by the hashtag highly likely Russia, attempting to make light of the poisoning. A clip of vehicles struggling in the snow as the beast from the east was posted by the government branch, suggesting the extreme weather was Russia's fault. And the video finishes with a penguin playing in snow, with the caption, "At least penguin enjoys it." U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson backed Britain, but hours later it emerged that Mr. Trump has sacked him. Mr. Tillerson said, "We have full confidence in the UK's investigation and its assessment that Russia was likely responsible for the nerve agent attack that took place in Salisbury last week." There is never a justification for this type of attack, the attempted murder of a private citizen on the soil of a sovereign nation, and we are outraged that Russia appears to have again engaged in such behavior. From Ukraine to Syria and now the UK, Russia continues to be an irresponsible force of instability in the world, acting with open disregard for the sovereignty of other states and the life of their citizens. We agree that those responsible, both those who committed the crime and those who ordered it, must face appropriately serious consequences. We stand in solidarity with our allies in the United Kingdom and will continue to coordinate closely our responses. Counter-terrorism police and intelligence officers are thought to have presented compelling evidence at the NSC meeting that Moscow ordered the hit in Salisbury over a week ago. The nerve agent Novichok that contaminated the victims was so secret that it was never known to have been used until now. Former Tory leader Ian Duncan Smith branded Russia a rogue state and demanded the most severe response. He said, "If we appease a country like this, then we should expect even worse." Commons Foreign Affairs Committee Chair Tom Tugendit said the use of nerve gas was a warlike act. Home Affairs Committee Chair Yvette Cooper said a cross-party stand was needed against Russian aggression. In an interview with the Evening Standard earlier, Home Secretary Amber Rudd pointed out that Mr. Putin had jibed in a Russian TV interview about not being able to forgive betrayal. She said, "I'm not going to enter into a kind of great big tit-for-tat with them, which is what they are longing, I'm sure, for us to do. Because when attribution comes, we have to be absolutely cool-headed about it. Other people can carry on making their comments. I think that the general public are wise enough to take a dim view of that kind of childish joshing." Mrs. May hinted that the prospect of pulling the England team out of the Football World Cup was not being considered. Asked about the team, she suggested officials could boycott the event, but did not go further. The dramatic moment in the House of Commons came after Public Health England stepped up their response by warning members of the public in Salisbury to wash their clothing and possessions 7 days after Mr. Skripal and his daughter Yulia fell ill. 3 cabinet ministers, including Boris Johnson, are understood to have been privately pushing the PM to respond with tough action after claims Britain's response to the 2006 murder of Russian ex-spy Alexander Litvinenko had not been enough. Ministers, spy chiefs, police and the head of the military were at the talks today on the progress made in the investigation. Military scientists at the Portondown Research Unit expect to be able to say beyond doubt that the rare nerve toxin was devised in a laboratory in Moscow. The PM is thought to have canvassed views from Foreign Office officials and Air Chief Marshal Sir Stuart Peach on the appropriate response if the evidence proves conclusive. Possibilities include full-spectrum retaliation across diplomatic, economic and military fronts, such as the immediate expulsion of senior Russian diplomats and spies, potentially cancelling Kremlin-linked oligarchs' visas, and asset freezes and travel bans. The government is also expected to meet MPs halfway on implementing a British version of the US's Magnitsky Act, which lists Russians involved in corruption and human rights abuses who are banned from entering America. Senior Whitehall sources said the government could also plan long-term consequences, such as boosting Britain's military deployments in Eastern Europe. Further options include covert consequences for Moscow that will never be revealed, such as an offensive cyber attack. Marina Litvinenko, whose husband Alexander died in London after being poisoned, said the government had promised her such a crime would not be repeated. Unfortunately, "It happened again. It means something was not done," she said. THEPM spokesman said senior British officials have been speaking with top officials from Britain's NATO allies, and further talks are expected in the coming days. Asked specifically if she was using NATO or UN language in her statement, he added, "That is not an Article 5 type statement." He also signaled that the government could back amendments being tabled by MPs to a bill going through Parliament to beef up the power to impose sanctions on cronies of Putin using dirty money to love the high life in London. A group of backbench MPs want the government to bring in a Magnitsky Law, which has already been introduced in other countries including the US. The PM's spokesman said the government has already passed legislation to beef up the sanctions regime. But he added that Mrs. May is looking to build the broadest possible consensus and conversations will take place with those who have tabled the amendment. NATO's Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg said the organization was concerned by the incident and that it was backing Britain. He said, "The United Kingdom has concluded that Sergei Skripal and his daughter were poisoned with a military-grade nerve agent of a type developed by Russia." And Prime Minister Theresa May stated today that it is highly likely that Russia was responsible for the act. "The use of any nerve agent is horrendous and completely unacceptable. The UK is a highly valued ally, and this incident is of great concern to NATO. NATO is in touch with the UK authorities on this issue. While Russia is not a NATO member, France is, and Theresa May spoke to her counterpart President Emmanuel Macron yesterday to keep him in the loop." A Downing Street spokesman said the Prime Minister spoke to President Macron of France to update him on the latest situation regarding the incident in Salisbury on 4 March. She outlined the conclusion reached by the government that it was highly likely that Russia was responsible for the act against Sergei and Yulia Skripal. They discussed the wide pattern of aggressive Russian behavior and agreed that it would be important to continue to act in concert with allies to address it. President Macron condemned the attack and offered his solidarity with the UK. They agreed that the French and British governments should coordinate closely as the investigation developed and following Russia's response. "Paralysis, convulsions, you can't breathe, and after that you die." Scientist who helped create the lethal nerve agent Novichok used to attack Russian spy in Salisbury reveals its terrifying effects. The Russian whistleblower who exposed the country's secret chemical weapons program has revealed the horrific effect of the Novichok nerve agents on their victims. Vladimir Zayanov described the use of the lethal toxins as a brazen attack by Vladimir Putin, who thinks he can use everything to kill enemies. Mr. Murzayanov says a large dose of Novichok paralyzes victims before it causes convulsions, you can't breathe, and after that you die. The exiled scientist shocked the world in 1992 when he revealed that promises by the Soviet Union to reduce its chemical weapon stockpiles were hollow. He worked in the top-secret Moscow laboratory, where a new generation of even more potent poisons was being perfected. These gruesome chemical weapons, named Novichok after the Russian for newcomer, were designed to be even more lethal than VX or sarin. At the time, one former top Soviet military advisor described them as political weapons, adding, "They have a powerful moral and psychological effect." Shockingly, they can be created from common, unrestricted and undetectable industrial and agricultural chemicals available worldwide. As a result, weapons inspectors fear other rogue nations, including Syria and North Korea, could have their own lethal stockpiles of the powerful nerve agents. Speaking from his home in New Jersey last night, Mr. Mirzayanov, 83, described the top-secret laboratory as a criminal enterprise. "It's a brazen attack," he said. Putin thinks he can use everything to kill enemies. "They don't tolerate any opponents. They should be punished. It's an open demonstration of this Russian terrorism. The Russian government is telling people who are thinking about revealing more secrets that they can expect the same fate." Asked how the nerve agent works, he added, "It's for paralyzing people, it causes you convulsions and you can't breathe, and after that you die. If you get enough of a dose of it. It's real torture, it's impossible to imagine. Even in low doses the pain can go on for weeks. You cannot imagine the horror, it's so bad." The Novichok family of nerve agents were secretly developed over 2 decades at a research facility 50 miles outside the Russian capital. Many times more potent than other better-known chemical weapons, Novichok agents can render gas masks and protective equipment useless. Sometimes described as gases, they are in fact liquid, intended to be delivered as a fine spray. A series of poisons, known as Novichok 5, 7, 8, and 9 to identify them, were produced amid conditions of complete secrecy. They all kill the same way. By inhibiting enzymes that control nerve receptors in the brain. One expert said victims simply forget to breathe. A tiny drop, almost undetectable, placed on the skin or inhaled can cause death within minutes. Describing his work, Mr. Mirzayanov said, "They were normal laboratories, they were not underground or anything. They were testing and developing. There were around 1,000 people working on this, it was a big deal. You have to test it on animals, and after that you have to study the chemical properties." So many laboratories were involved. In 1987, one physicist at the laboratory was saved despite being exposed to the chemical when a ventilator stopped working. Witnesses described how he staggered out of the room, describing seeing bright hallucinations before collapsing and being rushed to hospital by the KGB. He was left with permanent injuries after being critically ill for 10 days and unable to walk for 6 months. Last night, experts described nerve agents such as Novichok as second only to the atom bomb as the most deadly weapons ever made. They said that, because the ingredients were so common, the poison was ideal for use in an assassination, as well as a weapon of mass destruction. Pharmacology expert Professor Gary Stevens said, "This is a more dangerous and sophisticated agent than sarin or VX, and is harder to identify. It causes a slowing of the heart and restriction of the airways, leading to death by asphyxiation. One of the main reasons these agents are developed is because their component parts are not on the banned list. It means the chemicals that are mixed to create it are much easier to deliver with no risk to the health of the courier." Professor Robert Stockman of the University of Nottingham said traces of nerve agents did not linger. He added, "These agents react with water to degrade, including moisture in the air, and so in the UK they would have a very limited lifetime. This is presumably why the street in Salisbury was being hosed down as a precaution, it would effectively destroy the agent." Russia went into denial early today, with a former FSB chief claiming scientists at Porton Down had poisoned ex-spy Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia. A top Moscow chemical weapons expert echoed the charge, while also alleging nerve agent Novichok did not exist. Moscow was scrambling today to respond to Theresa May's demand for an explanation for the Salisbury attack by midnight. In an extraordinary blast, Vladimir Putin's predecessor as FSB Secret Service Chief Nikolai Kovalyov claimed Porton-Down government laboratory which identified Russian-made Novichok as the agent that poisoned the Skripals was likely to have been behind the attack. "There is a laboratory near Salisbury which is famous all over the world," he dismissively told Britain. "Check if anything leaked from there." Meanwhile, chemical weapons scientist Dr. Anton Utkin, a former UN inspector in Iraq, denied the existence of Novichok and echoed the claim that Britain may be responsible for the poisoning. He led the destruction of chemical weapons in Russia. "I was dealing with elimination of Russian chemical weapons, and with all the responsibility I can say that we have never had a weapon under this name," he said. "Actually, it is very strange that British experts have found out the formula of this super-secret poison nobody knows about. It is not clear either how they managed to determine that it was produced in Russia. If you know the technology, it is not possible to find out who made a chemical weapon. If the method is the same, the formulas of the substances will be identical. So this news only provokes more questions." Utkin said the West had earlier made a toxic noise about Russia's alleged use of chemical weapons in Syria. And now, right in the heart of Great Britain, this traitor is killed with a neuroparalytic substance. All this happens at a very convenient time before the Russian presidential election and World Cup. "If I were British, I would not blame Russians, but check my own security systems first." Something strange is happening there. It is not the first time when criminals are walking around the country with highly toxic and radioactive substances, and the secret services have no idea about it. Dr. Utkin has worked for the State Scientific Research Institute of Organic Chemistry and Technology, which is suspected of being behind the development of Novichok starting in 1973. Kovalyov, now an MP, said the accusations by May were a provocation against Russia. "There was no sense for Russia seek to kill a spy convicted 12 years ago when the publicity would damage the campaign for the presidential election," he said. "Just be logical. There is no logic here," he said. "England is turning into a dangerous country. If I were to speak for the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, I would have issued a statement that would not recommend our spies and traitors to live there because it is dangerous to these citizens," he said.